Some men call justice a word in a law book. I came to know it as a Winchester rifle in my hands and the names of dead men who thought they were above retribution. After they shot Virgil and murdered Morgan, I vowed to hunt every last one of those cowards across the Arizona territory. They would learn what happens when you wound the wolf but leave him breathing. I remember the first time I laid eyes on Tombstone. The year was 1880. The silver mines were bringing in $25,000 a day, and the town had the look of something torn between civilization and chaos. The streets were lined with saloons, gambling halls, and theaters. Respectable businesses stood, shoulder to shoulder with dens of vice. The air always carried the scent of opportunity mixed with danger. My brothers and I came seeking a fortune away from lawman duties. I had been a peace officer in Wichita and Dodge City. Morgan and Virgil had their own history wearing badges. We were tired of risking our lives for monthly pay that barely covered expenses. In Tombstone, we invested in mining claims and gambling concessions. We bought property. For once, we were building something instead of just surviving. My wife, Mattie, traveled with me, though our marriage was already showing strain from my gambling and ambitions. Morgan brought his wife Louisa. James brought his wife Bessie. Virgil came with his wife Allie. We were the Earp clan, and we stuck together. That was our way since boyhood in Illinois and Iowa. When our father Nicholas moved us around seeking opportunity, we learned that family was the only certainty in an uncertain world. We made friendships in Tombstone quickly. Doc Holliday, the dentist turned gambler with consumption slowly eating his lungs, followed us there. He and I had a bond forged in Dodge City that most men never understood. Mayor John Clum supported us. The Tombstone Epitaph newspaper painted us as the civilizing force the town needed. We represented law and order to the business interests who wanted Tombstone to grow respectable. But not everyone welcomed us. The cowboys, as they called themselves, controlled much of the territory outside town. They were cattle rustlers, stage robbers, and border raiders. They stole cattle from Mexico and sold them to the mining camps. They numbered in the hundreds. The Clanton family and the McLowry brothers were among their leaders. Ike Clanton, Frank McLowry, Tom McLowry. Names that would soon be written in blood. Johnny Bean, the Cochise County Sheriff, played both sides. To our faces he was cordial. Behind our backs he aligned with the cowboys and their interests. He resented our influence. He resented me personally after Sarah Josephine Marcus, his companion, turned her affections my way. Men have killed for less on the frontier. Virgil accepted the job of town marshal in October 1880. The town council was reacting to the murder of Marshal Fred White by one of the cowboys. Virgil deputized Morgan and sometimes me when trouble seemed likely. We were now officially the law in Tombstone. The battle lines were being drawn, though I did not fully see it then. The winter of 1881 brought rumors of a stagecoach robbery attempt. Bud Philpott, the driver, was murdered. Evidence pointed to cowboys connected with the Clantons and McLowrys. We investigated. We pushed. They pushed back. Each confrontation built upon the last. Each threat and accusation raised the temperature. Doc Holliday, never one to back down from conflict, added fuel with his sharp tongue and quicker temper. Those were good days despite the tension. We ate our meals together as a family. We attended the theater and dances. We played billiards at the Oriental Saloon, where I had an interest. We were becoming men of means and standing. We were building the lives that our earlier hardships had prepared us for. If I had known how fleeting it would be, perhaps I would have held those moments more carefully in my memory. The summer of 1881 saw the conflict with the cowboys intensify. Cattle rustling increased. Stage robberies grew more frequent. The Clanton and McLowry ranches became known as safe havens for outlaws passing through the territory. Wells Fargo hired me as a shotgun messenger on their coaches. The company also asked me to track down bandits who robbed their shipments. This put me at direct odds with the cowboy faction. I remember the morning I confronted Ike Clanton and Frank McLowry about stolen mules found on their property. The conversation turned hostile quickly. Frank told me that any man who came to their ranches searching for stolen livestock would be stretched out. This was not an idle threat in a territory where men went missing regularly. I responded that if they ever tried to stretch out an Earp, they should bring plenty of help. Doc Holliday complicated matters with his unpredictable nature. He had a confrontation with Ike Clanton that nearly ended in bloodshed. I managed to separate them, but the damage was done. Ike believed Doc had revealed details about a proposed scheme where Ike would help capture wanted cowboys in exchange for reward money. Whether true or not, Ike was convinced we had made him vulnerable to retribution from his own associates. The situation with Johnny Bean deteriorated further. He spread rumors that we were the real criminals in Tombstone. He collaborated with the local Democratic newspaper to paint us as villains while portraying the cowboys as misunderstood victims of Republican persecution. Behan had ambitions beyond the sheriff's office, and we stood in his way. October 25th, 1881. Ike Clanton came to town and spent the night drinking heavily. He was armed despite a town ordinance prohibiting carrying firearms. He boasted to anyone who would listen that the Earps and Doc Holliday were dead men. He swore he would kill us on sight. By morning, his threats had reached us from multiple sources. Virgil, as town marshal, could not ignore such public threats. He found Ike on the street and disarmed him. He brought him before Judge Wallace, who fined him $25 for carrying weapons in town. Ike paid and was released. Rather than leaving Tombstone, he collected his weapons from the courthouse and continued his threats. The morning wore on. Tom McLowry arrived in town and had his own confrontation with me. Words were exchanged. When he claimed to be unarmed while clearly carrying a weapon, I struck him with my pistol. This was standard practice on the frontier for dealing with armed men making threats. Meanwhile, Ike had been joined by his brother Billy Clanton and Frank McLowry. They gathered at the OK Corral. Witnesses reported hearing the cowboys promise to kill the Earps on sight. Mayor Clum urged Virgil to disarm them before blood was shed. Virgil deputized Doc Holliday and me. Morgan was already a deputy. Virgil hoped our show of force would convince the cowboys to surrender their weapons peacefully. He took Doc's walking stick, hoping to avoid using firearms. We walked down Fremont Street toward the cowboys. I remember the stillness in the air, the way the sun cast our shadows ahead of us on the dirt street, the weight of my Colt revolver against my hip, the sound of our boots in the dust. We found them in a vacant lot near the corral, 6 of us facing each other across a space no wider than a bedroom. Virgil called out. He told them they were under arrest and needed to throw up their hands. The next few moments remained burned into my memory, though they passed in seconds. Billy Clanton and Frank McLowry reached for their guns. Morgan, Doc, and I drew our weapons. Virgil still held the walking stick, the air filled with gun smoke and the thunder of revolvers. When it ended, Billy Clanton lay dead. Frank and Tom McLowry were dead. Ike Clanton had fled during the shooting. Morgan was shot through the shoulders. Virgil took a bullet in the leg. Doc had a minor wound. I alone emerged unscathed. The gunfight at the OK Corral had lasted less than 30 seconds. It would echo through our lives forever. The aftermath came swiftly. Sheriff Bean arrested us for murder. Judge Spicer held a hearing that lasted nearly a month. Witnesses for the prosecution changed their stories repeatedly. Ike Clanton claimed we had murdered his brother and friends in cold blood. In the end, Judge Spicer ruled the evidence showed we had acted within the law. We were released. The cowboys were enraged. Tombstone became divided between those who supported us and those who called for our blood. I thought the matter was settled by the courts. I was wrong. The cowboys were not men who respected legal decisions that went against them. They preferred revenge delivered from the shadows. They would not face us directly again. They would strike when we least expected it, and they would target those I loved most in the world. December 28th, 1881. The night air carried a winter chill as Virgil walked home from the Oriental saloon. I had offered to accompany him, but he insisted he would be fine alone. From an unfinished building across the street, shotgun blasts tore through the darkness. Virgil fell, his arm shattered by buckshot. His back and side were peppered with lead. I heard the shots from inside the saloon and ran out to find my brother lying in the street. We carried Virgil home to Alley. The doctor said he would live, but would never use his left arm properly again. The buckshot had destroyed bone, muscle, and nerves. The once strong arm that had wielded the walking stick at the OK Corral now hung useless at his side. Sheriff Behan made a show of investigating. He questioned a few men and declared there was insufficient evidence to make arrests. The cowboys responsible drank openly in saloons, boasting of shooting an Earp. Their friends in high places ensured they remained free. The territorial governor refused our requests for help. I swallowed my rage and focused on caring for Virgil. I told myself that justice would come through legal channels. I still believed in the system I had upheld as a lawman. I was a fool. March 18th, 1882. Morgan and I were playing billiards at Campbell and Hatch's saloon. Our wives were at a play at Schieffelin Hall. The evening had a normal feel, a rare moment of relaxation in the tense months since the gunfight. The glass in the back door shattered. Gunfire erupted. Morgan cried out and fell. The bullet had entered his back and torn through his body. I held him as his life drained onto the floor. I will never forget his final words to me. He looked up, with pain clouding his eyes, and said, "I realized he would not die alone. I told him I was there with him. I assured him he would be all right, though I knew it was a lie. He died in my arms, my hand pressed to the wound that had already taken too much of his blood. The grief hit me like a physical blow. Morgan was my youngest brother, the one I had promised our mother I would protect. Now he lay dead because I had brought him to Tombstone, because I had made enemies who struck from the shadows rather than face us man to man. We took Morgan home and laid him out. Louisa collapsed beside him, her grief too heavy to bear. The women wept. James drank himself into oblivion. Virgil sat with his useless arm, silent tears tracking down his face. I felt something harden inside me, something cold and implacable taking root where warm blood had flowed before. Sheriff Behan arrived to investigate. He asked perfunctory questions. He wrote notes he would never refer to again. He offered condolences that rang hollow to my ears. I watched him perform the theater of law enforcement while knowing he would do nothing. Perhaps he had even known the attack was coming. Perhaps he had encouraged it. We attempted to use the legal system one final time. We gathered witnesses who had seen Frank Stillwell, Pete Spence, and others planning the murder. We presented evidence of their involvement. The response was silence from officials. Cochise County had become a place where cowboys could murder with impunity if their victims were named Earp. We placed Morgan in a coffin and put him on a train bound for California. Virgil was too injured to remain in Tombstone. He and Allie would accompany the body to our parents in Colton. We knew the cowboys would try to finish what they had started. We knew they would attack the train. I made my decision then. The law had failed us. Justice would come from my hands or not at all. I requested a leave of absence from my position as Deputy U.S. Marshal. It was granted. I selected the men I could trust with my life and theirs. Doc Holliday, despite his illness, was the first to volunteer. Turkey Creek Jack Johnson and Sherman McMaster, both former cowboys who had broken with the Clanton faction, joined us. Texas Jack Vermillion and Dan Tipton rounded out our company. 6 men against the cowboy network that spanned the territory. We armed ourselves methodically. I carried a Colt Frontier 6-shooter and a sawed-off 10-gauge shotgun. Each man chose the weapons he was most proficient with. We obtained the fastest horses available, knowing our lives might depend on outrunning pursuers. We gathered ammunition, supplies, and enough money to sustain us during what might be a lengthy campaign. I studied everything known about the men responsible for attacking my brothers. Frank Stillwell, Pete Spence, Curly Bill Brocius, Johnny, Ringo, Indian Charlie, John Barnes, Florentino Cruz, known as Indian Charlie, Johnny Barnes, Hank Swilling. I memorized descriptions, habits, known hideouts. I learned which ranches sheltered them. I identified allies who might warn them or mislead us. We established a communication network of sympathetic ranchers, miners, and telegraph operators who would pass information about cowboy movements. Wells Fargo agents, grateful for my previous service, provided intelligence. Newspaper editor John Clum offered support through the epitaph. We would need every advantage against opponents who knew the territory intimately. I obtained warrants for the arrest of Morgan's murderers. These were legal documents signed by a judge. In truth, they were a shield against murder charges. I had no intention of bringing any of these men to trial. They had chosen the path of assassination rather than open confrontation. They had forfeited any right to the protections of the law they despised. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. We would track each man on our list. We would find them wherever they hid. We would deliver the only justice they understood. There would be no warnings, no chances to surrender, no mercy, shown to men who had shown none to my brothers. I knew the personal cost would be severe. I would become what I had spent years fighting against. A man who took the law into his own hands. A man who killed outside the boundaries of badges and courts. Mattie begged me not to go. She saw the change in me and feared the man who would return, if one returned at all. I could not be swayed. The path was set the moment Morgan breathed his last in my arms. We made preparations to move Virgil and the women safely out of Arizona. The cowboys would target them for retribution once our campaign began. Allie and Louisa would accompany Virgil and Morgan's body. James and his wife would follow separately. I said goodbye to my brothers, not knowing if I would see them again in this life. The night before we departed, I sat alone cleaning my weapons. I thought about the life I was leaving behind. Marshal, businessman, husband. I was exchanging these identities for a single purpose: vengeance. The cold clarity of this transformation brought neither comfort nor regret. It simply was. Like the desert after sundown, like the bullet that finds its mark. Some decisions are beyond the reach of emotion. We left Tombstone on March 20th, 1882, 6 riders with hard eyes and resolute hearts. The vendetta ride had begun. The cowboys who believed they had broken the Earps would soon discover their gravest error. They had left one brother standing, one brother who would not stop until justice was served cold as Arizona steel. We rode first to Tucson, following the same train route that carried Virgil and Morgan. Intelligence suggested Frank Stillwell planned to ambush the train there. Stillwell had been at the scene of Morgan's murder. He was a known associate of the cowboys and had threatened us publicly. The train arrived at dusk. We positioned ourselves around the station, watching for any sign of the ambush we anticipated. As darkness fell, we spotted several figures moving toward the train. I recognized Stillwell immediately. His distinctive appearance and manner of movement were unmistakable. He and Clanton were attempting to board the train where my family traveled. They were armed. Their intentions were clear. I moved forward with Doc and Texas Jack. Stillwell saw us and ran for the railroad tracks. I pursued him with the speed, born of rage and determination. He stumbled on the rails. I caught him as he tried to rise. He knew why I was there. He began to plead for his life, claiming he had no part in Morgan's death, despite witness testimony placing him at the scene. I looked into the eyes of one of my brother's murderers. I told him his time for talking was over. The 10-gauge shotgun roared in my hands. Frank Stillwell became the first name crossed off my list. Ike Clanton, always the coward, escaped in the darkness. His time would come. Word of Stillwell's death spread quickly through cowboy territory. Sheriff Bean, true to form, issued warrants for our arrest rather than for Morgan's other killers. We were now hunted men ourselves. The difference was that we did not hide. We rode openly through the territory, moving from ranch to ranch, settlement to settlement. We received information that Pete Spence and the others had sought refuge at his woodcutting camp in the South Pass of the Dragoon Mountains. We rode there immediately. Spence had fled before our arrival, but Florentino Cruz remained. He was known to have been part of the group that killed Morgan. When confronted, he admitted his involvement and implicated others. He identified the remaining conspirators. His confession did not save him. We left his body for Spence to find upon his return, a message that nowhere was beyond our reach. March 24th found us near Iron Springs. We were tracking Curly Bill Brocious, the acknowledged leader of the cowboy faction. Intelligence placed him and several cowboys at the spring. We approached cautiously, aware that they might have been warned of our coming. As we descended toward the water, gunfire erupted from concealed positions. We were ambushed by the very men we sought. I spurred my horse forward rather than retreat. 8 cowboys rose from behind rocks, Curly Bill among them. He fired a shotgun directly at me, but missed. I did not. My shotgun caught him squarely in the chest at close range. He fell dead in the spring water, his blood turning it red. The other cowboys continued firing. Texas Jack took a bullet in the arm. Doc narrowly avoided being hit multiple times. We returned fire, wounding several before the remaining cowboys fled. Curly Bill had been the most dangerous of our adversaries. His death demoralized the remaining cowboys. They began to scatter, seeking safety outside the territory. Some fled to New Mexico, others to Colorado or Texas. They discovered what I had promised. There was nowhere they could hide that we would not follow. Johnny Barnes was next. We tracked him to a remote cabin, based on information from a sympathetic rancher. He drew on us when we approached. 3 of us fired simultaneously. He managed one shot that grazed Sherman McMaster before falling. The list grew shorter. The message grew clearer. Retribution was certain for those who had participated in the attacks on my brothers. Johnny Ringo presented a different challenge. He was cunning and well-connected. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. We pursued him for weeks across the territory. Reports of his whereabouts often led to empty campsites or false trails. In July, he was found dead in West Turkey Creek Valley. Some said he took his own life, seeing the inevitability of our pursuit. Others suggested Doc Holliday had finally caught up with him. Doc never confirmed nor denied these rumors. It was enough that Ringo would never threaten my family again. As April turned to May, our vendetta took its toll on us, as well as our targets. We rarely slept more than a few hours. We ate when possible. We treated wounds with whiskey and determination. Doc's consumption worsened with the constant riding and exposure. His loyalty never wavered, despite the cost to his failing health. We were bound by a purpose that transcended comfort or self-preservation. By the end of our campaign, we had accounted for all the men directly involved in the attacks on Virgil and the murder of Morgan. Some died by our hands. Others fled beyond our immediate reach, but lived in constant fear. The cowboy faction that had once terrorized Cochise County was broken. Those who survived did so by abandoning their former associates and keeping clear of Arizona territory. We had become what circumstances demanded, men who delivered justice when the law would not, men who understood that some debts can only be paid in blood. I felt no pleasure in the killing, no satisfaction beyond knowing that Morgan could rest easier and Virgil could begin rebuilding his life without looking over his shoulder. The cold purpose that had driven me began to recede, leaving exhaustion and the weight of all that had occurred. The Arizona territorial authorities eventually dismissed the charges against us. They recognized, though would never publicly admit, that we had accomplished what they could not. We had ended the cowboy reign of terror that had plagued the region for years. Business interests in Tombstone and throughout the territory quietly expressed their gratitude for the return of stability. I never returned to Tombstone. The silver boom was already fading. The town that had promised so much had taken more than it gave. Virgil recovered as much as was possible with his crippled arm. He later served as a lawman in California and Nevada. James drifted between mining camps, never finding the success he sought. Doc Holliday succumbed to his consumption in Colorado in 1887. I was not at his side at the end, a regret I carry still. My marriage to Mattie did not survive the vendetta. The man who returned was not the man she had married. She succumbed to laudanum addiction and took her own life in 1888. I had failed her as surely as if I had placed the bottle in her hand. I later found companionship with Josephine Marcus, who remained with me through the decades that followed. I wandered for years after leaving Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, California, Nevada, Alaska during the gold rush. I dealt faro in gambling halls. I refereed boxing matches. I invested in mines. I chased opportunity as I had always done. The notoriety of the OK Corral and the Vendetta ride followed me. Newspapers embellished the stories with each retelling. I became a legend while still living, a strange experience for any man. In my final years, I tried to set the record straight. I worked with writers to tell the true story of Tombstone and the events that occurred there. Some listened, others preferred the legend to the man. I cannot blame them. The West was changing, the frontier was closing, people needed their heroes, and villains clearly defined. The truth, with its complexities and contradictions, seldom makes for satisfying narrative. I've been called many things: lawman, gambler, murderer, hero, villain, avenger. I was simply a man who lived by the code of his time and place. When the law failed those I loved, I became the law. When justice was denied, I delivered it from the barrel of a gun. I did what was necessary. I did what was right by the standards that mattered to me. Morgan rests peacefully in the California earth. Virgil lived to old age despite his wounds. The cowboys who thought they could break the Earps learned the cost of such ambition. If there is judgment to come for the lives I took, I will face it without regret or excuse. A man makes his choices and lives with their consequences. My brothers could not defend themselves. I could. That made the choice clear. The Arizona Territory eventually became a state. Tombstone faded from prominence as the silver played out. The frontier justice I dispensed gave way to courts and prisons and a more civilized approach to law enforcement. Perhaps this is progress. Perhaps not. The law works well enough when all men respect it. When they do not, there will always be need for those willing to stand against them, whatever the personal cost. That is my story. The revenge ride of 1882, the justice that came from the barrel of a Winchester when all other justice failed. I was Wyatt Earp. I buried my brother. I avenged his murder. I lived with the consequences. In the end, what more can be said of any man?